I think the whole idea of self-worth is such a um it's such a common word, but it's not something people talk about a lot, or maybe they do in different ways. Like people talk about self-love, and all that stuff and self-care. And I kind of all think they're part of this like larger story about like how do I, stay proud of myself, even when I'm not the best version of myself, or as I'm working towards being the best version of myself? How do I stay confident? So I'm curious how you would define self worth, because
Mm,
when I think of self worth, you know, I think of like self esteem. So do you think the same, or do you have like a more in depth
that's a
definition of
great,
self worth?
great question. I have thought a lot about this. I mean, I'm always learning. And I think there maybe is a slight distinguishment between self worth and self esteem. They're very close. Self esteem, in my mind, is kind of the regard we hold ourselves in, kind of comparative to our circumstances, right? It's like, well, I know what I'm going through. I know what I can bring to the table. I respect myself. I think a lot about self esteem is self respect. Like, I understand what I've got to work with, I understand what I offer. I can respect myself. Self worth, I think, is a kind of layer deeper. It kind of gets into that really tender, really vulnerable, really childlike zone where we remember and we sort of realize, oh, yeah, when I was a kid, like kind of my earliest memories for most of us, I loved myself and I appreciated myself and I valued myself literally independent of any kind of like results or merit, right? Sort of that time before we could perform, before we could prove, we had an understanding of our own worth and of others' worth, right? I really think children are the teachers here. I often, like, when I'm around like my nieces and nephews or my friends' kids, I'm always like kind of, not in a weird way, but I'm like so quietly observing them. And I'm like, wow, they get it, because I really do believe that. Like, we come into this world with an innate understanding of how full of worth we are and every other human. And then over time, we have all these experiences that kind of erodes that and distracts us and breaks us down. We all go through stuff. So, self worth to me is like a very deep self love. It's a very deep appreciation for who we are at the core. And we see that mirrored back in everyone around us. So, that to me is kind of my working definition of self worth. And I'm constantly learning more. I don't think it's like a fixed definition. I keep kind of finding new layers to it. So that's the current version. But I mean, maybe in a year I'll have another
Well,
one.
that's a great version, and I think you touched on a very important point. I think it's a lifelong journey, and obviously the definition is going to take different shapes depending on where you are in your life. But you said something that really stuck out to me, relating to like not feeling like you have to prove yourself,
Mm-hmm.
because I think as we get older, we we have all these expectations from society, and then we also create expectations for ourselves. And I think we tend to get in our own heads. And sometimes, funny enough, we can be our harshest critics, and really, devalue ourselves when nobody else is really devaluing us, and just feeling like we're not good
Yeah.
enough. So I know that you're on this journey, but I just wonder, you know, how can people who are struggling to find their self worth, how can they start on that journey? What tips do you have for them to kind of find their self
Mm,
worth?
I love that, because one of the things that I've learned so far is we don't find our self worth. We don't like discover it, we remember it. And it took me a while to understand that. I used to say the same thing. I was like, oh, I'm on a journey to, learn my self worth, or I can't remember what I'd say. But over time, I was like, no, Christine, it's a remembering. Like, this whole concept is built on the idea that I came into the world knowing this. And if you believe in, like, we existed before, maybe, or a past life or something, like it might already be, it's like embedded in our system. And so that's really helped me. And hopefully it'll help anyone listening who's like, oh my gosh, these you guys, I'm light years from owning my worth. I get it. I mean, I've had some pretty low self-worth moments, but I think that's a key to start it's about remembering what we already know. And that takes some time. Usually, if it's hard to even wrap your head around this concept right now, the first step is to be really kind to yourself, really compassionate, and start to just very slowly, as you're ready, kind of dig deep and start to let yourself unpack, like, what has made me forget how worthful I felt when I was a kid, or, kind of your happiest memories. If you can go back into the early days, what has blocked me from that? And oftentimes this is not going to be pretty, right? This is where the pains, the traumas, the disappointments, the heartbreaks are going to come up, kind of those difficult moments we've all faced. And I think that's where we can start, is say, it's okay to go back in here and start to unpack and realize, like, oh yeah, that story I made up when I was such and such age, and I got that feedback from my parent, my teacher, my coach. When that really, really rough things happened and I decided it was my fault. And that's, I think, a starting place, because then it's a matter of not having to like climb Mount Everest by like learning some, nirvana kind of concept. It's like, oh, okay, if I know I knew this at one time, how can I kind of trace my steps back? So I would start there and just, like I said, be super kind to yourself, because likely it's not, some tough stuff is going to come up. You might need to have some good cries. You might need to do some journaling. But every time I've ever worked with, a coach or read a book or listened to a podcast that got me kind of a step closer, it always kind of allowed me to say, hey, it's okay that I've forgotten some of these parts of myself. Like, I don't need to judge that I've done that, but this is where the remembering begins.
You can follow A Word to the Wise on Instagram and TikTok at A Word to the Wise Pod. We're also on YouTube at A Word to the Wise Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe. If you are enjoying the show, please rate, leave a review, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Till next time, peace and love, always, always, always.